it's a great pleasure to be here. It's for already, I'm really regret for having to leave already tomorrow because I teach on Sunday. I already learned so much, also yesterday with the conversations with some of the friends about the topic, the urgency of thinking, which means is something that becomes more and more ambiguous and enlightening. And we managed to do something?
You just have to tell me what
that's urgent, yes.
Yes, that's really
where is...
your folder and put it here, or document.
But I don't know where is the document, where it is there. And so anyway, just about one thing, because indeed, and of course, as always with Gil, with his titles, with his thoughts, I try sometimes to resist because I am the disciple here. And it is obvious and it is documented that I was the one who asked Gil. It was, I will tell you the story from my point of view. I went once to the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, and I met someone who told me, have you read this article, the new article in Jewish Social Studies? And I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, horrible. So I said, okay, horrible, why should I bother? But then after 2 minutes, another person came and asked me if I read this article that just came out in Jewish Social Studies. I said again, no. And he said again, something like that, horrible. After the fourth, I realized that it was before before this revolution of communication that I have to see this article. I have to take a bus to the library, to photocopy it, to go home, to realize that the dissertation I completed a few months earlier should be totally revised because of this horrible article. And then it was dedicated to my teacher, who turned to be the teacher also of the author, named Gil Anijar, about whom I heard something before, dedicated to the memory of Amos Funkenstein, who was the teacher of both of us. And then I immediately wrote a letter with two issues. First, I agree to be your ambassador in Israel because you are the enemy of the public, because you wrote about the Orientalism of the Kabbalah. He didn't write about the expulsion of the Palestinians or things like that, but about Kabbalah studies. Now we are okay? Okay. And second, that I want to be his disciple. Then when I first met him, we realized that once in a previous age, I was also his tutor when he was an undergraduate student. So I'm very honored to be one of Gil's students, and again, as usual, to think about, in different ways, about his challenges. After trying to resist for many years to his recent book about blood, to realize how wrong I was here again. And I really want to think about what is urgent, and I really think about our situation. I really tried to think, when I was invited, about different aspects of this urgency, and as it is written in the introduction, in our period of many changes, although I don't know whether there was ever a period which didn't have changes, or whether we are waiting that this period of changes, this revolution, will suddenly come to a kind of a completion or something like that, especially as someone who also works on early printing and always think about this period of incunabula, in which people did recognize printing but didn't understand what it is. And I think that it's quite similar to our understanding of new technologies, whether we can reflect. I do feel many times as if I'm thinking about the printing press, let's say in 1500s or so, or even later, when there was evidently mass of printed books, but no understanding. And of course, what is urgent? What is the urgence of thinking? Certainly not the urgence of writing, because in fact, urgence of thinking means that we are writing too much. Let's stop for a minute. Urgence of, not urgence of protesting, because protesting means to preserve our terminology, which perhaps is the problem. It's the urgence of thinking means something to suspend everything we are doing. It's something, as I tried to say already yesterday, suicidal in a way. I mean, because the urgency of thinking is to think, to reflect about what we are doing in the academy, this production of the academy, this what they are calling crisis of the humanities, which is a permanent crisis, of course, or better, crisis of secularism. Although, interestingly, I thought that conspiracy theories are, in a way, secular because it means that it is not divine, in a sense. So we can't accept the world as it is because we are still secular. And when I was thinking about, this urgency, and you know, I assume I'm not the only one, and I'm going to talk about Israel-Palestine, which is an exceptional case, but we have to take it out of its exceptionality because otherwise we always preserve the rule and we forget so many other exceptionalities. There is always the feeling of urgency, especially after 2000, in which the world simply collapsed, although we don't know it yet. I mean, what does it mean to live in a world in which terminology simply collapsed? And when we discover it, we never discover it immediately, we sometimes discover it only later. The catastrophe is not coming. To a certain extent, this is my feeling. I don't think that it is exceptional to critical Israelis at all. The catastrophe is there. The only solution we have anyway is a Messiah. And in this case, I always come back to very familiar text and want us to read together this text that we all know, but I will try to bring them into Palestine. I think that Walter Benjamin receives another dimension when we read him against the construction of the political construction of his close friend Gershom Scholem, who in fact was one of the creators of Zionist ideology, but also one of its critiques, which is very interesting. And to think, to maybe in this context, to understand things that I never understood, and maybe together we can understand them. And I don't know, I mean, I have some thoughts to share with you, not a clear thesis or something. My main issue always is the notion of exile and its association with messianism, but certainly not in the conventional way we talk about messianism. Maybe messianism of Benjamin, that for me at least, is the last Jewish thinker of this issue. For I cannot understand Benjamin but through earlier Kabbalists, about whom he may have heard from Scholem, mainly people who lived in the center of Safed, Palestine, in the 16th century. Amazing moment in the history of Jewish thought, but a center that was created by people who were exiled as younger from Spain, spent several decades in different places of the Ottoman Empire, then came as exiled to Palestine. They didn't return to Palestine like Zionists are doing. He came as exiled to Palestine to an amazing encounter with Muslim theology and to establish a combination that Scholem recognized indeed as crucial, but distorted it to a little bit. Now, I mean, so I start always with this thesis that was repeated again and again, and I'm sure that all of us know it, the eighth thesis of in Benjamin's 1940 Über der Begriff. And I want to read it, and I want to ask about the question I underlined. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of exception in which we live is not the exception but the rule. Yes, the state in 1940, in fact, Benjamin writes against what will become the dominant perception of the Holocaust as the exceptional, as the unique, exceptional, the one about whom you can't speak, you can't compare or to any other things in the world. Even before, as if he knew it, he tells us that. Yes, we must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. I will not find the German now. In this computer, I will try so there are, of course, many questions of translation, but anyway, I want to take it out of the German to a certain extent. Because that's one of the problems of this thesis. They are written as part of German or Jewish tradition. So we miss it. I mean, we miss the moment in which they were read. As if, okay, let's see exactly the relation between Benjamin and Goethe or Luriani Kabbalah. That doesn't matter here. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of exception. And this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. That's something that it's not clear. I mean, volumes were written about it, but all these volumes, in fact, did nothing but trying to bring about a real state of exception. Not that we are different in this sense. Yes, we are sitting here in this lovely place. We're enjoying this hospitality here, and we want to try to bring a real state of exception to a place in which I assume, but from what you see, that people first want to get out of the state of exception that exists anyway after this amazing storm. And what does it mean to bring? This is the urgency of thinking that we are talking about, to bring about a real state of exception. What does it mean? How can we bring a real state of exception? What will be the real state of exception from our point of view? And of course, I have to refer immediately to Mark's question earlier. Who is us? The tradition of the oppressed teaches us. Who are us? We are not the oppressed, said tell us Benjamin. We, us, we, for Benjamin in 1940, we who basically belong to the upper classes, who find ourselves suddenly in a state of exception as part of the oppressed. We are not we, yes? Then we, the upper, those who are not oppressed in the moment, should think about it, namely to go to the place which is dangerous, namely to establish our anxiety from the beginning, to go to the places that we don't know. And this seems to me the part of what Gilles alludes in the urgency of state, because our images of redemption, our images of emancipation, our images of democracy and humanity are maybe the problem, because they prevent us from thinking. They prevent us from doing it. That's what Benjamin go, not to bring about a real state of exceptions, means to go to the place in which you indeed almost committing suicide. You risk yourself. You have to risk yourself in order to do that. Otherwise, tells us Benjamin, otherwise you simply support fascism. Because to contradict fascism to anything else, not only to liberalism, which is clear for Benjamin, is not sufficient. One reason why fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponent treats it as a historical norm. The current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible is not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge unless it is the knowledge that the view of his story which gives rise to it is untenable. I mean, in other words, as long as we do not criticize the idea of progress, we generate Nazism, we generate extermination, and so on and so forth. It is not the opposite. And this is exactly what happened with the exceptionalization of the Holocaust. The exceptionalization of the Holocaust was essential in order to maintain the story of progress. I don't think that there are no exceptional aspects. I think that the Jews are exceptional in Christendom, no doubt about it, because it's not a minority, it's part of the Christian story. I don't think that you can talk about progress, and this is another story in which I was inspired by Carlo Ginzburg, outside of the understanding of the Christian ambivalence towards the Jews. Because here lies the only pre-modern example of the idea of progress, of truth replaced by a higher truth. It's not of the Old Testament that leads to the New Testament, of the figurative interpretation that is essential for the understanding of the previous. Jewish exile, to a certain extent, the conception of exile was defined counter this perception of the New Testament. Zionism, by the way, and I will say it now, I will hope to return to it later, was not to the Bible, but to the Old Testament. Namely, Zionists' return to the land was to return to the Bible in its Christian understanding, in that sense. So the exceptionalization, the process to say it is unique, and this is not only a historical perception, it's almost a legal perception today. The struggle, I refer also again to my student, to my teacher Gila Nijar, the struggle against anti-Semitism. This is exactly the point in which you have to divide anti-Semitism. I mean, I think the Jews are the only minority who is not oppressed today, and to keep our perception. Benjamin, in 1940, before the Holocaust, but you know, in the state of 1940, the worst moment, nobody knows to whom he's writing after all. In 1940, you would not expect someone to read you, because who can read you? Why should you would expect that the war will come to its end in 1945 in the collapse of Nazism? You wouldn't. And then, but we still, that's why I think that it's most of the many commentators will say that it is very pessimistic, which is crazy. I mean, it depends what we call pessimistic, of course, but to write in 1940 this text means that you are really, in a sense, I wouldn't say optimistic, because this is against the understanding of this text, but it's not pessimistic at all. But then it tells us we have to do something against ourselves, to do something against our notion, not simply to wait that it will follow, certainly not to say that it is exceptional, even if not in order to minimize or to in any way underestimate the horror of this destruction. It's, to a certain extent, earlier, it goes hand in hand with something that young Gershom Scholem, the pre-Holocaust Gershom Scholem, wrote about Palestine in 1931. In 1931, Gershom Scholem criticizes Zionist policies in a way that will be followed later but by Hannah Arendt in some of her most important essays of the 40s, in my opinion. I think that her writings about Zionism can be understood only if we read them together with the general book she wrote at the same time, Origins of Totalitarianism. Young Scholem says he's not so young, but he's a difference than the one I will show immediately. Zionism took its stand, whether involuntarily or, as was more often the case, voluntarily, on the side of declining rather than rising forces. It saw its success in the intrigues of war, Versailles and San Remo, and the signing of the Mandate as a victory. But this victory has now become a handicap and a stumbling block for the entire movement. The force which Zionism joined in those victories was the manifest force, the aggressor. Zionism forgot to link up with the hidden force, the oppressed, which would rise and be revealed soon after. Could the liberation movement indeed be on their side, or more accurately, take shelter under the wings of the victors of the war? Many of the socialists in our camp do not care for such questions and are enraged when one speaks of the imperialism to which we are wedded through the Balfour Declaration and so on and so forth. It's a critical, anti-colonial text against the colonialism of Zionism, 1931. In a very sensitive moment in Palestine, after the riots of 1929, the declining forces, yes, the binary, interestingly binary questions, but from within. But what is interesting for me for thinking about Benjamin is the last sentences that Sholem said. If it is still possible for an entire movement to change its way and attempt to join up with the powers that will determine the shape of the coming generation, it's clear. This I do not know, but I do know that it has no other way. Zionism must return to the sources that it betrayed in the hour of its victory. Better that the movement, no, that's not what I wanted, I'm sorry. Okay, but you can read it. Okay, and anyway, he talks about the dangers of the Orient, the emerging Orient. Islam, he never mentioned the word Arabs, Muslims, interestingly, but it's there. I mean, we have to bring it back in order to generate the real state of exception, because this is the real state of exception. This is the main question. This is the main question. We can understand it, of course, differently after reading the Jew, the Arab, because it's the Jew who will turn at the same time to be a Muslim in the camps. And this state of exception, and then following, before Benjamin, he says, and if we do not win once again, and the fire of revolution consumes us, at least we will be among those standing on the right side of the barricades. That is an understanding of earlier Sholem to the concept of Judaism, in fact. To be on the right side of the barricades, not surviving. Surviving is not important. It's impossible, even, to work through the idea of surviving. It's meaningless to think about Jewish revival and to think about simply the survival of the Jewish people. It's not important for him. The right side of the barricades, which is not clear, but it's clear, dangerous. We should take it, otherwise Zionism is impossible. And this sentence still is relevant today, even more relevant, after 48. Because that's the point in Palestine, and that's one of the exceptionalities that nobody is talking about. And this is the place in which the exceptionality Zionism can teach us about the rule. It's a question of the refugees that indeed threaten the existence of Israelis. But this is the real state of exception that we, in that sense, Israeli Jews, should generate in order to think. It's clear. It's ridiculous if you take it as simple like that. Yes, simply the Jews and the Palestinians will recognize each other and not take into consideration the fact that it is indeed dangerous, like Sholem reminds you here. Because otherwise it's not interesting. Of course, it's precondition to recognize Palestinian rights, from my point of view. This is the beginning of any thinking of mine. That's the recognition of Palestinian rights means also the recognition of Palestinians' right of return, the recognition of the Palestinian refugees is obvious. But then we have to start maybe thinking again about a different conception of history to which Benjamin brings us. And Benjamin indeed, and this is again something that I think that it is really important to say, that Zionism is exceptional will mean to ignore totally Benjamin, because it means that the rule is okay. Israel is not a democracy, Israel is not secular, Israel is the exception, true, but Israel is the exception of Europe. Israeli nationalism is exceptional because it is messianic. And Sholem knew it very well. Because the main issue in Israel today is the temple. And the temple, as we can learn from Benjamin, is not, the idea of the temple is not against Zionism, secular Zionism, but on the contrary, it's the result of secularism. It's the result because secularism is the realization of the theological discourse. And the idea of a Jewish state did not emerge among Jews, but it emerged in the 16th and 17th century by Christian, Protestant, millenarian thinkers, mainly in Britain, together with the idea of the state itself. So the idea of Israel emerged by Newton, for instance, together with the idea of the Leviathan, together with Hobbes. You speak about the state, and this European state is the return of the Bible. That's what we learned from Leo Strauss, among other things. It's the biblical, it's the modern political discourse is finally the return, the biblical discourse, the making of the Bible as the main aspect of political thinking. The idea of the nation is always associated with biblical images in the West. And then, later, it was also accepted by the Jews, who wanted to return to the East in order to become part of the West, when they were considered in Europe as Orientals, identified with the Muslims. And the idea of Zionism is that the Jews should return to the Orient in order to become Western. That's a transformation of the Jew. In order to, they don't return to early Judaism, they return to the origins of Western civilizations. They accept it. Although this perception that the Jews are the origins of Western civilization, this idea of the Judeo-Christians that dominates the world today against Islam is of course Christian. It's the Judeo-Christian. And therefore against this Christian ambivalence toward the Jews, I think we should also see Benjamin as referring that's it? Space. I do it. It's a real state of exception now. Without the text, the burning text, I wrote about books that were burned. Anyway, no, it doesn't want. There is a conspiracy here. And indeed, its origins came also in the 16th century in this revolution in Safed that I mentioned before. I will say about it, and was obviously a source of inspiration for Benjamin. It is unbelievable sometimes. I mean, how he got all this from his conversations in Munich with Gershom Scholem, who just started learning it. I don't know how he could debate Scholem exactly about this, because what Scholem has done when he talked about Safed is to distinguish what he called Jewish mysticism as an independent tradition from the Jewish law. Because the issue for Scholem was to define Judaism without the Jewish law, the halakha. And in Safed, what is interesting about this center is that they came to Palestine at the same time of the revival of the Bible in Europe, in Protestant Europe. They came to Palestine, but the period to which they wanted to associate it with them was not the biblical one, but the period after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the lack of any Jewish sovereignty. Not any, I will explain immediately. To the moment after the destruction, to the period that in Jewish periodization is called the period of the Tanaim, those who wrote the book of the Mishnah, the foundation of the Talmud, the Talmudic period, let's say the beginning of Talmudic period, that was denied both by Christians and by secular Jews, the Talmud itself. But they saw this period itself as the moment of revelation. This was the period in which there was a revelation after. So this is Safed. This is the holy city of Safed, not a biblical place, post-biblical place. But in Safed of the first centuries after Christianity, yes, we are talking about the early Christian period. I mean, historically thinking, the second to the fourth centuries in northern Palestine witnessed both the rise of Christianity and the rise of Judaism. As we know it, historical Judaism and Christianity, it's not that Christianity followed Judaism and Judaism is ancient. Two interpretations to ancient Judaism emerged together. The Jewish one argued that the destruction does not mean, like the Christian, it's not a testimony for the second coming of the Messiah, for the second revelation, not the second coming of second, for the second revelation of Jesus, but on the contrary, that the world is in exile, and that the state of the Jews demonstrate the state of the entire world. And in Safed of the 16th century, it was even demonstrated in the most extreme way by Rabbi, the rabbi called Ha'ari, Luriani Kabbalah, who argued that the exile of the Jews is the exile of the cosmos. And our urgent mission, urgent any moment, urgent, messianic in that sense, messianic in the same as an obligation to go and to collect the sparks of the broken world. Messianism in this understanding is not expectation for a moment in the future. It's a permanent action in the present in a way that I think can be explained by, it's this one, no? Yes. Ah. And in a way that can be, but it's not so, I mean, in a way that I will not manage anyway, in a way that can be explained by this text of Benjamin. To generate permanently the real state of exception. This was later developed by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the most important Jewish modern thinker without whom we can think about Jewish Hasidism, but also about Kafka. So this is the moment. A real state of exception. Messianism is not expectation for the king, not the restoration, nothing like that. It's a permanent demand to try to find yourself in a state of anxiety, to go to the dangerous places. Danger, as Benjamin tells us there, is the moment from which, only the way from which you can understand history. In a state of danger, in a situation of danger. Namely, when you, this is the moment that is okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
But I don't know, okay, but no, I don't have time to go through this, I think. No? So we have here two ideas of sovereignty. I call them now Christian and Jewish, but this will be historically not correct because the interrelation between the Jewish and the Christian are, of course. It's not that I really want to say that you can distinguish Christian from Jewish historically. I call them because of some moments in which they appear like that at the beginning. How you this is, after all, the difference between Judaism and Christianity. How you interpret the historical significance of the destruction of the temple. How, which is appeared in the interrelation between the Jewish Pesach that insists on the continuity and Easter that insists on the two revelations. And what does it say about the Jewish law? Is it relevant, as Jews will say, or non-relevant, as Christians, but also Sholem will say? And Benjamin, who knows nothing about Jewish law, insists in his correspondence with Sholem about Kafka that the law, and Benjamin's question of the law, of course, deserve a different lecture, should be discussed. Now, if we want to try to think about the real state of expression, because I have to finish, we have to go to another reader of Benjamin, Mahmoud Darwish, the great Palestinian poet. Mahmoud Darwish, in his last years, really spent a lot of time reading Sholem, reading Benjamin. As Sinan Antoun showed recently, it is obvious to see in his last poems the way he corresponds with Benjamin, but from the state point of view of the victim, who thinks about his killer. Has a beautiful poem about the murderer and the murdered who find themselves together in a hall and trying to find the way of emancipation. In fact, what Darwish is saying, and unfortunately I don't have the time, so just see I will not talk about this wonderful poem with the amazing title, Who Am I Without Exile? I mean, the opposite of exile cannot be negation of exile, because this is Zionism. We have to think about exile. We don't have to say that our exile is something that simply should come to its end. It's an experience from which we are talking, but, and because after the discussion of the mirror today, I thought that maybe a few lines from in this paragraph can tell more. On the last evening on this soil, on the last evening of this soil, we cut off our days from the shrubs, and the translator, by the way, is called Gila Nijar, and we count the ribs that we will carry with us and the ribs that we will leave behind there. An ancient time grants to this new time the keys of our doors. An ancient time, the biblical time. You see, the Safed Jewish community was inspired by Sufi theology. I think that Safed Kabbalah is Sufi to a large extent. Here, the ancient biblical times, Zionism, they denied Safed. This is the religious Jews, not like us, the good secular Jews. And it's a secularism. Yes, we are progressive. We are a progress. But this ancient times grant to this new time the keys of our doubts. Come on in, O conquerors, to our homes and drink our wine from our complacent muwashaja, for we are the night when it splits into no dawn arrived by a horse riding, arriving, and so on and so forth, just for these few lines. And the mirrors are many. Come on in so we can come out of them. Come on. Darwish is always speaking to the Israeli Jews. Come on in, so, because, I mean, his Hebrew was amazing. Come on in so we can come out of them, and soon we will seek what has been our history around your history in the distant lands. And we will ask ourselves in the end, was Al-Andalus here or there, on the hearth or in the poem? It was written in 1992, 500th anniversary of the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from Spain. It takes together the Jews and the Muslim, and I think that I will simply stop here without many other things, because that's what I should do, right? Thank you.